Martin Bradley had always believed in the quiet dignity of symbols. Not flashy slogans, not blaring protests, but small, intentional acts that whispered conviction. After decades working in large-scale spatial design, museum installations, touring exhibits, architectural showcase pavilions, he finally decided to scale down, to recalibrate his life to something more manageable. He wasn't escaping anything. No midlife crisis, no disillusionment. He simply needed stillness, predictability, and space. And so he moved to Sycamore Heights, a well-landscaped, meticulously maintained suburban enclave on the outskirts of Denver, where rules were clear, lawns uniform, and silence prevailed after 9 p.m. The house itself was unremarkable by most standards, a modest two-story property with a stone path leading to a wraparound porch and a small front garden boxed by symmetrical hedges. But to Martin, it was exactly right. Clean lines, neutral tones, room for a studio in the garage. He unpacked slowly, intentionally, placing each item with care, not as a designer but as a man reclaiming a space for himself. It was during this process, while unsealing the long, rectangular box containing his late brother's belongings, that the idea first came to him. His brother, Thomas, had served in multiple overseas tours with the 173rd Airborne. He was quiet, steady, unsentimental. The only thing Thomas ever asked of Martin was to design a display for the old battalion flags he'd kept rolled in tubes for years. When Thomas passed, too early, too suddenly, Martin took possession of everything. Medals, uniforms, documents, and those flags. He never built that display. Life got in the way. Projects piled up. Clients demanded. But now, with time finally his own and the house his sanctuary, Martin decided to follow through. Not with a dusty shelf indoors, but as a living tribute outdoors. He installed 4 custom flag brackets along the front porch railing and raised 4 flags, each representing a different unit his brother had served in, each one historically accurate down to the stitching. They weren't gaudy or oversized, nor were they elevated above the roofline. Just a quiet line of fabric fluttering in the wind, bearing the muted reds, greens, and navy blues of military heritage. No banners, no slogans, just history. To Martin, it wasn't a statement. It was memory. It was the closest thing to ritual he had. Every morning, he'd come out with his coffee, stand by the porch, and nod to the flags just once, the way he used to nod to Thomas whenever he saw him in uniform. It wasn't grief anymore. It was respect, daily and deliberate. Neighbors noticed. Some smiled. A few gave him the 2-finger wave. No one said anything for the first few weeks, and Martin took that as quiet approval, or at the very least indifference, which he welcomed even more. He had no desire to draw attention, make friends, or stir the collective waters. He maintained his yard meticulously, mowed regularly, edged the walkway. He even hired the recommended landscaping crew from the community newsletter to install seasonal planters that matched the aesthetic guidelines outlined in the welcome packet. He read the bylaws, not skimmed but read, and saw nothing disallowing flags. In fact, there was an entire clause about the respectful display of national, state, and commemorative insignias. Martin had no doubt he was in compliance. It was a Tuesday when the letter arrived. Neatly folded, slipped into his mailbox, printed on cream paper with an embossed gold crest at the top. Community Standards Notification, it read. The tone was bureaucratic but edged with condescension. Your property has been observed to be in potential violation of Section 8.2.1, Symbolic Fixtures and Displays. The presence of multiple unapproved flag installations may constitute a disruption to the visual harmony of Sycamore Heights. Please remove all non-authorized flags within 48 hours to avoid a formal citation. Martin read the letter twice. There was no mention of which flags specifically were unauthorized, no list of acceptable displays, no signature, just a stamped seal and a generic return address. His first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief, then confusion. He immediately went to the bylaws again, scanned Section 8.2.1, and confirmed. There was no clause prohibiting historical military insignia, nor was there language limiting the number of flags, so long as they did not interfere with landscaping or obstruct signage. He photographed his display from 3 angles, each one clearly showing an unobstructed sidewalk, visible house number, and fully compliant installations. He drafted a letter in response, firm, polite, factual, citing the exact clause in the bylaws and asking for clarification. He included photos and expressed a willingness to meet and discuss the matter. He printed it, signed it, and walked it to the association office 2 blocks down. The door was locked. He slid the letter into the mail slot and returned home, unsettled but not worried. The next morning, he found a red notice zip-tied to his front door handle. Second warning. Non-compliance will result in further enforcement action including, but not limited to, fines, access restrictions, or referral to the Neighborhood Disciplinary Committee. This time it was signed, M. Hart. Martin recognized the name from one of the neighborhood flyers. Melissa Hart, board member at large, known for organizing summer socials and chairing the beautification task force. She lived 3 houses down, 2 pastel planters flanking her driveway and a prominently placed Community First banner hanging year-round from her balcony. Martin stood on the porch, holding the red notice, staring at the quiet cul-de-sac. For the first time since he'd moved in, he felt a chill, not from the wind, but from the stillness around him. No eye contact from passing dog walkers, no waves, just closed windows and blinds half drawn. He looked back at the flags. They weren't just cloth now. They had become the catalyst for a conflict he hadn't chosen. Still, he wasn't about to surrender to veiled threats and paper intimidation. He wasn't a veteran, but he'd spent his life around those who were, those who understood the cost of silence and the value of standing firm. He decided to leave the flags up, not defiantly, but plainly, as they had always been. He updated his file with dates, documents, timestamps. He informed his insurance company in writing that he was receiving official notices and possible property interference. And quietly, he began to keep notes. Nothing investigative or conspiratorial, just a log of events. Who walked by, what was said, what disappeared, what arrived. He wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing for accountability. It was a matter of principle now. Not pride, not attention. Just the unwavering belief that some things shouldn't be negotiated. Not when they honored the lives of people who'd never come home, and certainly not when they posed no harm to anyone other than those who were offended by remembrance itself. And so, the flags stayed. And the silence around him grew. It was the third notice that changed the tone. Unlike the previous 2, this one wasn't taped to the door or slid quietly into the mailbox. It was delivered in person. Martin was sitting in his living room, reading with the windows open, when the sharp knock at the door echoed through the house. It was mid-morning, a Tuesday, and the air was warm with the scent of freshly cut grass. He rose without rush, assuming it was a delivery or perhaps one of the neighbors. But when he opened the door, he was met by a woman in a light gray skirt suit, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest, and her expression practiced in its neutrality. "Mr. Bradley?" she asked as though she didn't already know. He nodded. "Melissa Hart," she said, not offering a hand. "I'm a representative of the community board. We've been trying to reach you." Her voice was polished and clipped, the kind that gave the illusion of politeness without the substance. Martin held the door half open and said nothing, simply waited. Melissa cleared her throat and looked at her clipboard. "We've issued 2 prior notices regarding the unapproved flag installations on your property. As of today, those displays are still present, and we have not received confirmation that they will be removed. This is your final verbal warning." She didn't sound angry. She sounded institutional, as though reading from the margins of a script that had been memorized and recited too often. Martin raised an eyebrow and gestured toward the neatly arranged flags still fluttering gently on their poles. None larger than a standard banner, each fastened securely and positioned away from pedestrian traffic or community space. "And I've replied in writing," he said calmly, citing the regulations that, to my understanding, I am well within. "I've yet to receive any clarification on what specific rule has been violated." Melissa's jaw tightened imperceptibly, and she tapped the clipboard once with her pen. "Visual cohesion and community harmony, Mr. Bradley. Section 8. The spirit of the guideline is just as important as the letter. Some residents have expressed concern that the flags you've displayed, while perhaps meaningful to you, may be interpreted as aggressive or unsettling. We strive to create an inclusive environment, free of visual conflict." Martin looked at her then, really looked. Beneath the carefully curated calm was something harder, something less administrative and more personal. This wasn't about flags. It was about control. He exhaled slowly, his voice still level. "History isn't conflict, Miss Hart, and I have yet to receive a formal complaint from any actual neighbor. Just these notices, unsigned, unclear, and increasingly hostile." Melissa didn't blink. "It doesn't have to escalate further. The board is prepared to impose access restrictions. Your fob may be deactivated temporarily. Clubhouse privileges may be revoked. And if compliance isn't achieved by Friday, we will proceed with a fine per procedural protocol." Then she handed him a sealed envelope and walked away without another word, her heels tapping sharply against the path like punctuation marks. Martin stood at the door for a long moment, envelope in hand, before finally closing it. Inside, he opened it carefully. The tone was the same, but the language had hardened. A formal notice of violation, a pending fine of $250. A threat of referral to a community disciplinary hearing, should the matter remain unresolved. No mention of his previous letter. No acknowledgement of the images he had submitted. No engagement with the content. Only repetition, threats, and the implication that what mattered wasn't rules or fairness but submission to authority. That night, Martin sat in the garage studio surrounded by architectural renderings and storage crates that hadn't yet been unpacked. He poured himself a drink and stared at the flags folded on the workbench, the duplicates he had made just in case. He didn't feel angry. He felt a pressure building behind his ribs, the kind that comes from being talked at instead of to, from being treated not like a neighbor or even an equal, but like a non-compliant file to be processed. The absurdity of it all sat heavy in his chest. 4 historical flags, displayed respectfully, now transformed into a community flashpoint not because of their appearance or meaning, but because someone, one person he was increasingly convinced, had decided they were inappropriate. The following morning, he received an automated email from the keycard access system. "Your account has been suspended due to a community infraction. Access to gym, pool, and common areas will be reviewed pending resolution. No hearing, no appeal, just silence and execution." Martin forwarded the email to his legal contact, a former client named Jean who had represented design firms in contractual disputes. She wasn't a litigator, but she knew how to read codes and policy frameworks. Within an hour, she replied with a single line. "This is shaky. Keep documenting. Don't remove anything yet." He trusted her judgment. She had seen how quickly power structures collapsed when challenged with precise language and persistent accountability. Later that day, as Martin walked back from the mailbox, he noticed that one of his flag brackets had been bent. Not broken, just warped, subtly, as if someone had twisted it just enough to make it look accidental. He checked his security camera footage, but the angle didn't cover the porch rail directly. That night, he moved one of the cameras to face the front steps, not because he expected vandalism, but because the pattern was becoming clear. Quiet escalation. He updated his log. Entry: bracket damaged, timing unknown, access revoked. Spoke to legal. He printed 2 copies and placed one in a sealed envelope inside his fireproof safe. The next morning, he found a second change. The small American flag at the corner of his lawn, standard size, mounted on a fixed post near the sidewalk, was missing. No break in the post, no remnants on the grass, just gone. He walked the perimeter. No trace, no note, no acknowledgement. He called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff to report it, not because he expected resolution, but because it mattered that the report existed. The dispatcher took the call professionally, logged the missing flag as a potential theft, and issued a case number. Martin added that to the log, too. 3 days passed without word. The silence from the board was complete. No calls, no emails. No follow-up from Melissa Hart. Then, on Sunday evening, as Martin was preparing dinner, the doorbell rang again. This time it was a man, broad-shouldered, mid-50s, wearing a light windbreaker with the community's name embroidered on the chest. His name tag read Dennis, Security Consultant. He introduced himself politely and asked if Martin had a moment. Martin stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Dennis launched into a rehearsed explanation about routine visual compliance checks and recent anonymous concerns regarding materials on property visible from the public sidewalk. Martin interrupted him gently. "Let me guess. Flags?" Dennis hesitated, then nodded once. "I don't make the rules, sir. Just here to make sure things are consistent. Some folks get nervous about what they see on porches these days." Martin folded his arms. What exactly do they think they're seeing? Dennis didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a laminated guideline sheet and pointed to a clause highlighted in yellow. No fixtures, banners, or displays deemed to imply militarization or partisanship without board approval. Martin stared at the clause. It hadn't been in the bylaws he received at move-in. Dennis shrugged. New updates. Not all residents got the revised draft yet. They're being finalized. That was it. The moment it shifted from petty policy to something else. Not rules, but retroactive enforcement. Not order, but opportunism. And beneath it all, the slow, tightening grip of power wielded by those who mistook order for authority. Martin looked Dennis in the eye. "You tell whoever sent you that I'm not moving an inch until I get something official. Signed, cited, stamped. And legally enforceable." Dennis nodded once, not unkindly. "Understood," he said and walked away. As the sun dipped low behind the row of identical rooftops, Martin stood on his porch, looking at the bent bracket, the empty pole, and the 3 remaining flags. This wasn't just about fabric anymore. It was about pressure, tactics, and the quiet assumption that most people, when pressed enough, will fold. But Martin had no interest in confrontation for its own sake. He wasn't out to win. He was out to remain, to exist without compromise in a place that had promised peace but was quickly showing its teeth. So, he took a breath. He refastened the remaining flags. And he began planning what would come next. The first official fine arrived on a Thursday, slipped between circulars in his mailbox as though it were no more significant than a coupon catalog. Martin opened the envelope without expecting much. Another notice, perhaps, another vague threat cloaked in regulatory language, but what he held in his hands was a citation, formally worded and bureaucratically sanitized, yet with the same Sharpie undertone he had come to recognize. Not law, not order, but control. The amount was listed clearly at the bottom. $300 due within 10 business days. Violation: unauthorized use of symbolic fixtures without community approval. C. Article 8.2.3a of the Visual Ordinance Guidelines. The fine didn't upset him. It wasn't about the money. It was the deliberate act of escalation, disproportionate, unilateral, punitive. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took the citation, placed it beside the others in a 3-ring binder he had begun to keep in his home office, each notice dated and logged with corresponding photos, video stills, and notes. He cross-checked Article 8.2.3a with the most recent version of the guidelines he had downloaded upon move-in. It wasn't there. It simply didn't exist. Whether it had been added later or fabricated entirely, he couldn't tell, but it was absent from any publicly available documentation. He forwarded the citation and the absent clause to Jean, his legal contact, and she responded within the hour. No such provision is on file with the county. If this is a new bylaw, they failed to record it. That's a procedural violation. He drafted an appeal and sent it by certified mail to the board's mailing address, citing procedural inconsistencies, the absence of the clause in any version of the recorded documents, and a formal request for a hearing to resolve the matter. He knew what would come next, and it did. 4 days later, another letter arrived, not acknowledging his appeal but escalating the matter, a summons to a disciplinary meeting, described as a non-adversarial resolution forum. The language was, as always, softened, polite, even soothing. But the structure was unmistakable. 3 board members, closed session, no recording permitted, recommendations enforceable under the authority of the community charter. It was dressed up in procedural legitimacy, but the heart of it was pressure. A room designed to corner, not to reason. Martin arrived precisely on time. He wore a collared shirt, neutral tones, no jacket. He carried a slim folder with printed documents, copies of the original guidelines, photographs, and the email from Jean, confirming that the cited article did not exist in any registered version of the bylaws. The meeting took place in a community center side room, sterile, quiet, the blinds drawn. The 3 board members were seated at one end of a rectangular table. Melissa Hart sat in the center, flanked by 2 men Martin didn't recognize, one mid-30s with the build of a former athlete, the other older, gaunt, with fingers steepled and a practiced stillness about him. They greeted him with polite nods, no handshakes. Melissa gestured for him to sit. The proceedings began with Melissa reading a prepared statement. She referenced the importance of unity, the value of neighborhood harmony, the historical precedent for regulating visual elements in shared spaces, and finally, the community's right to uphold those values through disciplinary measures. Her tone was careful, polished. It was the voice of a school principal who believed her authority was benevolence. When she finished, Martin asked if he might respond. She nodded once, and he spoke slowly, evenly, not to provoke, but to clarify. He laid out the timeline. The installation of the flags, the subsequent notices, his written appeal, the absence of the cited clause, the inconsistencies in enforcement. He made no accusations. He made no demands. He simply laid the record bare and concluded with a simple question. Under what specific authority are you issuing fines based on regulations that are not recorded or distributed to residents? Melissa paused for a fraction of a second before replying. The board reserves the right to interpret and update visual compliance standards as necessary to maintain neighborhood cohesion. It was the most honest thing she had said in all their exchanges. It was also the most dangerous. Martin didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't invoke legal threats. He stood, thanked them for their time, and left the room, folder in hand. Nothing conceded, nothing surrendered. That evening, he sent a certified letter to the county office requesting confirmation of all registered community bylaws and amendments over the past 12 months. If the clause didn't exist in those filings, then the board's actions weren't just misguided. They were unsanctioned. That same night, someone keyed his car. Not deeply, not across the doors or the hood. Just one line, about 8 inches long, at the base of the driver's side door, low enough to be missed unless you knew where to look. He saw it in the morning, knelt beside it, ran his finger gently along the groove. The message wasn't the scratch, it was the placement. Not vandalism, but presence. The kind of quiet warning that says, "We know where you are." He didn't call the police. There were no witnesses, no cameras pointed directly at the car, and no visible suspects. Instead, he documented the damage, photographed it, added it to the binder, and forwarded the image to Jean. Her reply was terse. "Keep everything. Don't respond." Days passed. The fines continued, now cumulative, with added penalties for non-compliance and disregard for community guidelines. His access remained restricted. Deliveries were delayed. Packages disappeared from his porch. His mailbox was left open twice, and always the same silence. No confrontation, no accusations, just procedural weight, pressing down in layers. Then came the neighbor. Her name was Diana Walters. She lived 2 doors down, had moved in 6 years ago, kept to herself mostly, but was known to volunteer for seasonal events. She approached Martin on a Sunday afternoon while he was working in the side yard, replacing solar lights along the walkway. Her voice was low, steady. "Mr. Bradley, I wanted to say something. I know what's been happening, and I know it isn't right." He looked up, caught off guard. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't angry. She was resolute. "They did it to the man who lived in your house before you," she continued. "Different issue. Same tactics. They bled him dry with fines until he sold." Martin didn't ask questions. He didn't press. He simply nodded, and Diana left it there. But her words stayed. That evening, he searched property records. The prior owner had sold the home for 20% below market average after just 11 months of ownership. He found nothing else. No complaints, no lawsuits, no public record. But the pattern was beginning to take shape. A week later, Martin received a letter not from the board, but from a real estate agent. It was friendly, informal, an invitation to consider options. "We understand the community isn't the right fit for everyone," it read. "If you're feeling overwhelmed by regulations or board interactions, we're here to help you transition smoothly into a neighborhood that aligns better with your lifestyle." It was signed with the first name only, no office listed. The envelope had no return address. He added it to the binder. There was no longer any illusion that this was about flags. It never had been. The flags were the excuse, the opening. What they wanted was submission or departure. What they didn't expect was resistance. Martin didn't plan revenge. He planned clarity. He updated his documentation, reached out to 3 other homeowners who had left within the past year, found 2 willing to speak off record, and prepared a dossier. Not for publication, not for spectacle, but for leverage. Quiet, methodical, precise. The battle had changed. It was no longer about aesthetics or policy. It was about ownership, of property, of rights, of place. And Martin, for all his measured calm, had no intention of ceding any of them. It was during a routine walk to the corner store, something Martin had taken to doing in the early evenings, more out of habit than necessity, that he noticed the woman waiting across the street from his property. She wasn't standing on a porch or trimming hedges. She wasn't pretending to be out for a stroll. She was just there, stationary, arms crossed, watching his house with the stillness of someone measuring the weight of a decision. When she finally saw him approaching, she stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a kind of practiced determination. Her name, she said, was Camille Dawson. She was a paralegal from a mid-size law office in Aurora that handled civic contracts and residential litigation. She wasn't from the neighborhood, didn't live nearby and wasn't representing the board. She was, however, familiar with the board, had in fact been involved in a background audit 2 years earlier after a similar wave of complaints had been filed and quietly resolved before anything formal reached the county registrar. Martin didn't invite her inside. They stood at the edge of his driveway near the trimmed shrub line in full view of the street, and she explained why she was there. The board, she told him, had recently filed an internal escalation report against his address. These reports weren't public, weren't shared with residents, and had no legal standing on their own, but they were often used to build a paper trail that, over time, would justify severe administrative action, lien threats, forced arbitration, targeted property reassessment. The language of the reports was intentionally vague, filled with descriptors like non-cooperative, hostile to compliance, and disruptive to visual peace. Martin listened without interruption, filing away every phrase. He asked how she had come across the report. She hesitated, then told him the truth. Someone inside the board's admin circle had leaked it. No names, no details, just a plain manila envelope dropped off at her office with a note. "He's next." That phrase sat with Martin longer than anything else she said. He's next. Not in trouble, not in violation. Next. As if part of a preordained sequence. Camille handed him a copy of the report. She made no promises, offered no legal services, but she gave him one suggestion: file a demand for procedural review with the county. It wouldn't stop the board, but it would trigger oversight, an external signal that someone was watching. They usually fold when the light gets too bright, she said. Then she left as abruptly as she'd come. That night, Martin stayed up late drafting the request. He kept it formal, emotionless, factual. He cited the unexplained changes to bylaws, the undocumented fines, the coordinated pattern of soft retaliation, and the existence of internal escalation documents unsupported by any public justification. He sent copies to Jean, to Camille's office, and to the county registrar. And then, for the first time in weeks, he slept without keeping one eye on the security feed. But the pressure didn't subside. It shifted. 3 days after the filing, a landscaping crew appeared in front of his house. Martin hadn't called them, nor had he received any notice. He stepped outside to speak with them, and the foreman, a man in his 40s with a clipboard and a Bluetooth earpiece, told him they had been contracted by the board to perform visual standardization. The phrase was unfamiliar. The meaning, however, was obvious. "You're not touching anything," Martin said, his voice calm, low. The foreman, clearly uncomfortable, made a call, spoke in hushed tones, then nodded and told his team to pack up. Within minutes they were gone, but the message remained, unmistakable in its arrogance. The board didn't need his permission. They were simply waiting for a window in which he might not be there. Jing called that evening. She'd spoken with someone at the registrar's office who confirmed that the request had been received and logged, and that an initial assessment had begun. It wouldn't stop the board outright, but any further action on their part would now be subject to retrospective legal scrutiny. That, at least, gave Martin breathing room. He used it wisely. He reached out to Diana Walters again, the neighbor who had warned him weeks earlier, and asked if she'd be willing to meet. She invited him over that Saturday, and they sat in her backyard, out of view from the street. Over iced tea and small talk, she explained how her previous neighbor, a single father with a teenage daughter, had been targeted over an unauthorized garden structure. He'd appealed, complied, paid fines, and yet the pressure never stopped. Eventually, he put the house on the market, barely breaking even, and disappeared without a word. Diana said she regretted not speaking up sooner. "They make you feel like it's not your fight," she said, "until it is." She gave him the name of another resident, Greg Sanford, 2 streets over, who had fought a similar battle the year before. Martin visited him that same week. Greg was blunt, unsentimental. "They want turnover, he said. New owners, new fees, higher property values. Long-timers are just noise in the system. Greg had fought them for 6 months over a privacy fence, won in arbitration, but still ended up selling after they denied him access to all communal services and refused to acknowledge his keycard. They freeze you out until you're a ghost, he said, and then they bury the evidence. Martin knew then what had to be done. Not vengeance, not sabotage. Visibility. He began drafting a formal open letter to the board, to be distributed within the community, not posted online, not shouted across fences, just printed, folded, and dropped in every mailbox. He kept the language measured, civil. He explained his side, referenced the procedural inconsistencies, quoted from county filings, and included excerpts from the bylaws. He didn't accuse. He didn't name names. He simply asked questions and provided documentation. At the bottom, he added a line. If this story feels familiar to you, you're not alone. If it feels wrong, you're not helpless. Then, with help from Greg and Diana, he printed 73 copies, each slipped into a plain white envelope with no return address. They were delivered by hand at dusk over 2 consecutive evenings. The effect wasn't immediate. No wave of protest, no outraged calls, no sudden collapse of authority. But in the days that followed, Martin noticed things. People who hadn't made eye contact in weeks now nodded as they passed. A small American flag reappeared on the porch of a home that had gone conspicuously bare. A decorative wreath, previously removed after board feedback, returned quietly to someone's door. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't even resistance. But it was, undeniably, a shift. And in the silence that followed, the board didn't respond. They regrouped, which meant inevitably they would strike again. But this time, Martin wouldn't be reacting in isolation. This time, he wouldn't be standing alone. Martin had always understood that power, real power, rarely announced itself with noise. It moved quietly, systematically, often in the form of paper, process, and plausibly deniable action. So, when 2 weeks passed without any formal retaliation from the board following the circulation of his open letter, he didn't allow himself the luxury of believing it was over. He knew better. The silence wasn't surrender. It was recalibration. A pause in the machinery as its operators adjusted the levers to apply pressure from a new angle. He maintained his daily routines with exacting discipline, never straying from regulation, never allowing his home or property to slip into any state that might give them reason to reignite their campaign openly. His flags remained, meticulously positioned and cared for. His yard was trimmed, his trash bins aligned to code, his porch lights functioning and timed. If they wanted another point of attack, they would have to invent it. They did. It began with a letter from the county building department. Not from the board this time, not directly, but from an official entity with letterhead and seal. The letter stated that a complaint had been filed alleging unauthorized modifications to the front porch of Martin's home, specifically citing structural attachments used to mount multiple pole-based installations. There was no mention of flags. The language was intentionally abstract, stripped of context, just ambiguous enough to warrant inspection. The county inspector was scheduled to visit the property in 5 business days. The implication was clear. This was no longer a neighborhood disagreement. This was now, at least cosmetically, a matter of regulatory compliance. Martin contacted Jean immediately. She requested copies of all correspondence and filed a preliminary response with the county, asserting the legal use of non-permanent fixtures and referencing the original property plans, which included porch railings capable of supporting decorative attachments. Still, the inspection would proceed, and Jean advised that Martin be present to avoid mischaracterization or default citations. The inspector, when he arrived, was courteous but impersonal. A man in his late 40s with a clipboard and a device for scanning structural tags, he walked the perimeter of the property, took photographs, asked no questions. Martin watched as he paused in front of the flags, eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before returning to neutrality. The inspection took less than 20 minutes. The report, received 3 days later, listed, "No structural violations found," but noted, "Continued review may be necessary pending Community Board resolution." It was a legal dead end, but a psychological success. It wasn't about finding fault. It was about reminding Martin that they could trigger disruption with a phone call, that they could hijack systems meant to serve, not suppress. The next blow came from a completely different vector. His mailbox, which until now had been a passive part of the harassment, occasionally left open, sometimes delayed, was suddenly central. Over the span of 10 days, Martin received 3 letters addressed to names that weren't his. They were official-looking, postmarked from private institutions, 2 of them financial in nature. He returned them to the post office, reported the irregularity, and was told such things happen occasionally. The 4th letter, however, arrived with a handwritten note taped to it. "Mail delivered in error. Please review." The name on the envelope was vaguely familiar. He opened it cautiously, unsure if he was violating privacy or uncovering manipulation. Inside was a complaint, allegedly authored by a resident named Anthony Lambert, requesting the removal of Martin's flags due to ongoing psychological discomfort and military-related anxiety. It was written in emotionally charged but disjointed language, the kind that felt constructed by someone attempting to impersonate vulnerability. Martin had never met Anthony Lambert, nor had he heard his name mentioned by any neighbor. A quick search through community records revealed no such resident. The letter was a plant, an attempted fabrication to suggest community unrest. Whether it had been sent through official mail or slipped into the stream by someone closer to home, he couldn't determine. But it served its purpose. It raised the stakes. Jean's response was swift and surgical. She submitted a formal inquiry demanding the identity of the complainant, citing due process and the legal right to face one's accuser in community enforcement matters. The board, predictably, did not respond. Instead, they issued a new violation, this time not for flags or porch fixtures, but for nuisance behavior inconsistent with the collective comfort of the neighborhood. The vagueness was deliberate, designed to be unfalsifiable. It referenced unofficial gatherings, distribution of materials without consent, and engagement with non-residents in ways that may compromise community security. It was, in effect, a condemnation of the open letter he had distributed weeks earlier, rebranded as provocation. Martin read the violation notice twice, then filed it directly in his binder. He responded with another letter, not angry, not defensive, just clinical. He pointed out the board's refusal to engage through legitimate channels, their pattern of retaliatory action following non-compliance with unofficial demands, and their ongoing effort to create an adversarial dynamic through invented infractions. He sent copies to the registrar, to Jean, and this time to a civil oversight group specializing in residential disputes. He didn't ask for intervention. He simply submitted a timeline. The response wasn't from the board this time, but from the community itself. Late one night, a neighbor he had never spoken with before, a woman in her 60s who lived on the far corner lot, left a note on his porch. It was brief. "They did this to my son when he moved back in with me. Said he wasn't on the lease even though he was my caregiver. I wish I had said something then. Let me know if I can help." Her note was followed by 2 others over the next week. Quiet affirmations. Not protests, not alliances. Just proof that he wasn't imagining the scope of it. But even as the community began to stir, the board adjusted their strategy again. The next act was physical. His trash bins, which he kept locked due to a local raccoon issue, were found open one morning, the contents partially scattered across the street. Initially, Martin assumed an accident. Wind, perhaps, or careless neighbors. But then he found one of the flag mounts, previously fixed with reinforced brackets, loosened. Not removed, just destabilized. Enough that it would eventually collapse under its own weight. A small, calculated act designed not to destroy but to send a message. Even your vigilance won't save you. He installed new brackets the same day, this time with reinforced locking screws and hidden fasteners. Then he ordered motion-sensitive lights for the front yard and side walkway, devices fully permitted under guidelines, mounted at the correct height and intensity. The next morning, a new violation notice was taped to his door, citing light pollution. He laughed aloud for the first time in weeks. It wasn't humor. It was exhaustion, disbelief, and the strange relief of confirmation that he was now inside a farce masquerading as governance. Jean advised filing a preliminary injunction against further fines. Not to win, necessarily, but to force the board into formal litigation, a setting in which their undocumented rules and retaliatory conduct would be exposed under actual law. Martin agreed. They filed the paperwork, and within a week the board was notified of pending legal review. The citations stopped. The harassment didn't. That weekend, his car alarm went off at 3:42 a.m. No sign of damage, no forced entry, just a triggered sensor. It didn't happen again. But his neighbor's dog, usually silent, barked intermittently through the night for 3 days after. Small things, disruptions, psychological warfare dressed in the plausible. Martin adapted. He adjusted his routines. He logged everything, and then he made a decision. It was time to respond. Not with escalation, not with confrontation, but with symbolism as sharp and deliberate as their silence. He designed it in one night. A temporary structure, modular, collapsible, self-contained. It required no excavation, no permanent attachment. Legally, it was a display, not a structure. Within 3 days, the materials arrived. Assembly took 6 hours. He positioned it directly across the street from the board's office, on a friend's lawn with permission and a signed waiver. The structure rose 10 feet high and spanned 20 feet across. It was simple in shape, geometric, abstract, but its surface was what drew attention. 500 flags, none of them real-world nations, but stylized emblems from historical, fictional, and symbolic sources. City-states, resistance movements, cultural motifs, lost civilizations, imagined futures. Each one mounted precisely, symmetrically, professionally. The installation included a single placard. Interpretation is subjective. Intention is not. Within 48 hours, residents were stopping to look, quietly taking photos, asking questions. No confrontation, no vandalism, no noise, just awareness. The board issued a letter demanding the removal of unauthorized propaganda. Martin responded with a scanned copy of the applicable code, noting the temporary nature of the structure, the absence of any banned symbolism, and the explicit permission of the property owner. He CC'd the registrar, the oversight group, and Jean. The structure remained, and for the first time, they didn't answer. The shift, when it finally arrived, was quiet, like the final click of a lock sliding into place. For weeks, the board had said nothing. No new citations, no flyers, no passive-aggressive bulletins tucked into community newsletters. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like compression, the air thick with withheld momentum. Martin continued his life with the same quiet vigilance that had sustained him this long, documenting, watching, adjusting, but never retreating. The flag installation across from the board office remained untouched, now fading slightly in the late summer sun, its battle banners no longer a novelty, but an enduring presence too public to destroy without drawing attention. Neighbors still passed by, some slowing their pace, some nodding in acknowledgment, but none mocking, none tearing it down. A boundary had been drawn, and even those who disliked it now understood that crossing it would cost more than rolling their eyes. Then came the certified letter, postmarked not from the board's return address, but from an out-of-county law office. Martin read it, standing at his kitchen counter, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds. The language was dense but unmistakable. The board had filed a formal complaint in civil court, accusing him of harassment, intentional disruption of community operations, and property devaluation through public agitation. It wasn't a cease and desist. It was a lawsuit. A real one, with a docket number, a court date, and an attached demand for the removal of all displays deemed unauthorized and antagonistic. It was the final play, pulling him into a venue where they could use the illusion of institutional legitimacy to silence him permanently. If he lost, it wouldn't just mean the removal of the flags. It would mean fines, restrictions, and a permanent mark on his public record. It would be the signal that standing your ground was an invitation to be crushed. Martin didn't panic. He scanned the letter and sent it to Jean, who responded within the hour. "They've overplayed. This is theater. They think you'll back down under pressure." But she didn't dismiss the threat. They would need to respond formally, prepare discovery materials, and, if necessary, subpoena internal communications to expose the board's pattern of retaliation. Martin agreed, calmly and without emotion. He had known, deep down, that it would come to this. He wasn't afraid of court. He was afraid of what it would cost, emotionally, financially, spiritually, but it wasn't about victory anymore. It was about clarity. Over the following weeks, Jean assembled the response. She cross-referenced every violation, every letter, every unexplained clause. She filed requests for documentation from the board, including internal minutes and amendment records. The board delayed, stalled, filed objections. But Martin, meticulous in his record-keeping, had prepared for this. He had time-stamped copies of all documents received and sent, logs of conversations, video captures of the altered bracket, and even digital correspondence verifying the dates of official bylaw updates. The depth of his documentation gave Jean leverage. The narrative she assembled wasn't one of a hostile resident with a vendetta. It was of a man systematically pressured by an unaccountable authority structure abusing its reach under the guise of aesthetics and harmony. The hearing was set for a Friday morning, 3 months from the date of the original installation. It was held in a small civil court building 15 miles outside the neighborhood, with minimal attendance, no press, no spectacle. Just cold hallways, legal pads, and procedural formality. Martin arrived in a dark gray suit, carrying nothing but a thin folder and the quiet steadiness of someone who no longer feared being misunderstood. The board was represented by a local attorney who spent more time reviewing his notes than making eye contact. Melissa Hart was present but silent, her posture rigid, her face expressionless. The proceedings lasted 3 hours. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for disliking theatrics, listened without interruption. The board's lawyer presented their case first, that Martin's displays violated the aesthetic tone of the neighborhood, that his public communication incited unrest, and that his installation across from the office was an act of targeted intimidation. Martin said nothing, watched quietly, noting how carefully the language avoided actual regulation. Everything framed in perception, discomfort, optics. When it was Joan's turn, she dismantled the case piece by piece. She laid out the timeline, exposed the fabricated bylaw citations, detailed the pattern of escalating pressure with no legal justification, and presented the physical evidence. The bent bracket, the keyed car, the planted letter from a non-existent resident. She cited the county's own findings that Martin had violated no structural code, no noise ordinance, and no confirmed community bylaw on record. She presented statements from neighbors, anonymized but signed, referencing similar experiences of pressure and forced exits. When she finished, the courtroom was still. The judge requested a brief recess, then returned 15 minutes later with a preliminary ruling. The court found insufficient evidence of harassment or intentional disruption. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. Furthermore, the judge ordered the board to cease any enforcement action related to the disputed displays unless new, legally registered regulations were passed through proper community procedure and made publicly available. In other words, if they wanted to make new rules, they'd have to do it openly, and they'd have to do it right. Martin left the courtroom without fanfare. No victory lap, no smug smiles. Just a quiet exhale as the weight of months lifted incrementally from his shoulders. It wasn't over. The board still existed. Melissa Hart still held her seat. The culture that allowed such abuse hadn't changed overnight, but something else had. The illusion of omnipotence had cracked, and with it, the assumption that resistance was futile. Word spread quickly within the neighborhood, not through confrontation, but through whispers, side conversations, emails, and subtle changes. The flag structure across from the board office remained standing. Other residents began placing small displays in their yards, some patriotic, some artistic, none asking permission. 2 weeks after the ruling, a notice appeared in the community bulletin. A board meeting would be held to discuss transparency improvements and possible revisions to the current compliance process. Attendance was optional. No details were given. Martin did not attend. He had no interest in spectacle. But he did notice that, for the first time since he moved in, his name was not on a list, his mail was not tampered with, and his keycard to the communal facilities had been quietly reactivated without apology or comment. It was not a clean victory. There were no banners announcing change, no sweeping reform. But there was space now, space to live without the constant threat of arbitrary punishment, space to exist without seeking permission for memory, for symbolism, for quiet pride. The war they had waged against him was not lost because he fought harder. It was lost because he didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't apologize for standing still. And for those watching, even in silence, that was enough. Autumn came slowly to Sycamore Heights, the kind of season that moved with restraint, as though cautious not to disturb the order of things. Trees lined the sidewalks in disciplined symmetry, their leaves turning muted gold rather than riotous red, and even the breeze carried a sense of quiet deliberation. For most residents, the weeks following the court decision passed with little disruption. Life returned to its rhythms, commutes, lawn maintenance, weekend errands. But the undercurrent had changed. There was a stillness to the board's presence now, not absence, but a recalibration of its reach. Flyers were still distributed, emails still sent, but the tone had softened. Enforcement became procedural again, not personal. Authority retreated into its proper place, not abolished, but stripped of its self-appointed armor. Martin didn't celebrate. He never had any appetite for vindication. In the days after the hearing, he focused instead on restoring what had quietly eroded inside him over the course of that prolonged confrontation. Ease, stillness, trust. He spent more time outside, not to signal defiance, but to reclaim the simple peace that had once drawn him to the neighborhood. He began repainting the porch railings where the flag brackets had once been forcibly loosened, not removing them, but integrating them more seamlessly into the woodwork, permanent, protected, no longer just visible, but embedded. He left the flags up, unchanged, fluttering with less drama than before, as if even they had grown tired of the fight. Neighbors greeted him more freely now. Some offered polite nods. Others stopped to ask about the banners, where they were from, what they represented. He answered when asked, never embellishing, never proselytizing. It wasn't about making a point. It was about preserving a truth, personal and enduring. A few residents even installed their own flags, modest and varied. Nothing political, just personal flourishes, state flags, family crests, military service banners tucked discreetly into garden beds. No one asked for approval. No one received a notice. At the next quarterly meeting, held in the community center with folding chairs and tepid coffee, attendance was higher than usual. Melissa Hart remained on the board, her posture unchanged, her tone as clipped as ever. But when the topic of enforcement reform came up, she did not dominate the conversation. Another board member, someone newer, younger, suggested open reviews of all existing bylaws, and to Martin's quiet surprise, the motion passed without resistance. It wasn't a revolution. It was adjustment. Slow, procedural, unglamorous. But it was real. Martin didn't speak at the meeting. He sat near the back, listened, observed. When it ended, a few residents approached to thank him. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with a kind of quiet sincerity that he understood far more deeply than praise. One man shook his hand and said only, "You gave us a template." That was enough. In the weeks that followed, Martin resumed projects he'd abandoned months before. He returned to his drafting table, picking up where he left off on a series of miniature installations he had once planned for a Veterans Museum exhibit. He reached out to a curator he'd known for years, floated the idea of integrating personal narratives into public design, and found the conversation welcomed. The dispute with the board no longer defined him, but it had reshaped something fundamental in him. The reminder that even the smallest structures, when threatened, reveal the full measure of what people are willing to defend. The installation across from the board office was taken down in mid-October. Not forcibly, not in secret. Martin dismantled it himself with the help of the friend who had hosted it on his lawn. The flags were boxed, labeled, archived. It had served its purpose. It didn't need to remain. Its absence was not a retreat, but a mark of having endured. No one tried to stop him. No one commented. When the space was cleared, the grass beneath had yellowed slightly, but the soil remained firm. That winter, as snow began to gather lightly on the rooftops, Martin stood on his porch one evening, hands in his pockets, looking out across the quiet street. The lights in most windows glowed gently, curtains drawn. The flags above him stirred